My name is Naomi Vance, and I am 41 years old. On the afternoon of my daughter's high school graduation party, I was standing at the edge of my own backyard, holding a tray of lemon bars nobody had asked me to make, listening to my sister give a toast about a party I had planned, paid for, and built from the ground up over 4 months. And not once, in the 2 minutes she spoke, did she say my name. I wanted Bree to have a graduation that actually looked like something, Vanessa said, raising her glass to the 40-some people crowded under the rental tent in my yard. Someone had to make it happen. People clapped. My mother dabbed at her eyes. My daughter, 18 years old in a white sundress, glanced over at me with an expression I couldn't quite read yet, and I stood there at the edge of my own party holding a tray of lemon bars, already knowing, the way you know a storm is coming from the particular color the sky turns, that I was about to spend the rest of the afternoon finding out exactly how much of this day had quietly stopped being mine. The tent was the same one I'd stood under 3 Saturdays running, stringing lights along the frame from a rented ladder, while David held it steady from below, and Bree, home from her last week of classes, handed up zip ties and told me I was doing it wrong, in the specific, loving way 18-year-olds correct their mothers. The tables were the ones I'd arranged myself the night before until midnight, checking a seating chart against 55 RSVPs 3 separate times, because I did not want anyone's great-aunt sitting somewhere she'd complain about for a year. None of that was in the toast. None of it needed to be, I told myself, standing there. It was supposed to be about Bree. I just hadn't expected it to also, so cleanly, not be about the 4 months at all. If you've ever done all the work behind a moment, and then watched somebody else take the bow for it, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I have a feeling there are more of us standing at the edge of our own parties than anyone wants to admit. I want to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what the last 4 months actually looked like. I'm a school administrator here in Tucson. My husband David travels for work more than either of us would like. My daughter Bree is our only child, and this spring she was accepted into the State University's nursing program on a partial academic scholarship that covers about half her tuition, which meant, for the first time in 18 years of careful budgeting, David and I finally had a little room to give her a real celebration. David sells industrial equipment across 3 states and is gone, on average, 10 nights a month, which meant that most of the actual footwork of this particular celebration, the vendor calls during my lunch break, the seating chart at 11 at night, the 4 separate trips to the party rental warehouse, fell, unremarkably, the way most of the footwork in our house tends to me. I don't say that with resentment. It's simply what was true that spring, and I think it matters for understanding exactly how much of that tent, that afternoon, existed because of decisions and phone calls nobody but me ever saw. I booked the rental company in March, a 20 by 30 tent, 8 round tables, 120 chairs, string lighting I put up myself over 3 exhausting Saturdays on a borrowed ladder. I hired a small catering company called Rosa's Table, run by a woman named Rosa Delgado who I'd used for a work event 2 years earlier and never forgot, because she remembers every detail you tell her and delivers on all of them, down to the specific brand of sparkling lemonade Bree had loved as a kid, which Rosa, unprompted, had remembered from a single offhand comment 2 years earlier and quietly sourced again for this party without my ever asking. Tent deposit, table rental, the full catering package for 55 guests, and the final balance, paid 9 days before the party. It came to just over $3,200, all of it out of an account David and I had been quietly building since Bree was a sophomore, specifically for this. I told exactly one person the full budget, my sister, Vanessa. Vanessa is 38, single, and has spent the better part of a decade moving between small business ventures, a skincare line, a candle company, most recently something called a curated event styling consultancy, that, as far as I can tell, has styled exactly one event, which was mine. This was not, if I'm honest, the first time. At Bree's middle school promotion 5 years earlier, Vanessa arrived 40 minutes late with a large, beautifully wrapped gift and spent the reception telling anyone who'd listen about how stressful the shopping had been, while I quietly handled a reserved seating mix-up, missing programs, and a meltdown from my own daughter about her shoe strap, unnoticed, in the parking lot. I didn't think much of it at the time. Smaller stakes, smaller crowd, and I was, back then, still in the business of not thinking much of it. It is only now, looking back from the far side of a much bigger version of the same pattern, that I can see how long it had actually been running underneath everything, quiet and consistent, waiting for an occasion large enough that someone would finally do the math out loud. She is warm in a way that draws people toward her immediately, the kind of warm that makes you feel, for the length of a conversation, like you're the only interesting person in the room. Our mother, Sylvia, has never once in either of our lives needed convincing that Vanessa was the more remarkable of her two daughters. I stopped needing that to be different sometime in my 30s. I thought I had made peace with it. I found out at my own daughter's graduation party exactly how much of that peace had been quiet exhaustion, wearing Peace's clothing. When we were girls, Vanessa broke our mother's favorite ceramic lamp playing indoor volleyball with a couch cushion, and by the time I got home from a friend's house 20 minutes later, the story had already calcified into me having done it, because I was always so rough with things, a description that had never once been true of me and has remained, somehow, permanently attached to my name in that house for 30 years anyway. I didn't correct it that day. I was 11. By the time I was old enough to know how to correct it, correcting it had started to feel like more trouble than it was worth. And trouble, in our family, was its own kind of currency you learned early not to spend carelessly. I don't tell you this to build a case against my mother, or even really against Vanessa, who I don't think was ever consciously cruel about it so much as she was. From a very young age, extremely good at being the version of herself that got believed. I tell you this because it matters for what happened 40 years later, on a Saturday afternoon in June, under a rental tent in my own backyard, because when Vanessa raised her glass and said someone had to make it happen, I don't think she was lying, exactly. I think she has spent her whole life in a family that made it very easy to believe her own story, and very hard for anyone, including me, to correct it out loud. Here is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it's going to matter in about 11 minutes. 2 weeks before the party, Vanessa asked me, over coffee, whether it would be all right if she helped coordinate a little, reached out to some of the family, made it feel more like an event. I said of course, thinking she meant decorations, maybe a playlist. I did not know, could not have known, that what she actually meant was that she was about to quietly become the public face of $3,200 I had already spent. The first thread came loose 4 days before the party, and I almost didn't notice it. My cousin Priya texted me, so excited for Saturday, just sent my contribution to Vanessa, hope it's enough, tell me if you need more for the caterer. I remember reading that text twice, standing in my kitchen, trying to understand what contribution she meant, because I had never asked anyone for a single dollar. I typed out a confused reply, and then, for reasons I still can't fully explain to myself, deleted it, and wrote something vague instead. Something in me already suspected that pulling on that thread 3 days before my daughter's party was not going to end with a quick, comfortable answer. I actually got as far as opening a text to Vanessa directly that same afternoon. I typed, "Hey, got a weird text from Priya about contributing to the party. What's that about?" And then I sat with my thumb over the send button for a long time, longer than a simple question like that should require. Some old, well-worn instinct in me was already doing the math on what it would cost to ask that question 3 days before my daughter's graduation party, weighing it against what it might cost not to. I deleted the message. I told myself I was protecting the weak. I understand now that I was protecting something else, a version of my family where I still got to believe my sister wouldn't do a thing like this, and some part of me wasn't ready yet to find out I was wrong. I let it go. That's the part I'm not proud of, but I think it's important to say honestly, I chose, for 3 days, to protect the day instead of protect the truth. I told myself it was probably nothing, a misunderstanding. Priya, getting confused about who to Venmo. It was not a misunderstanding. By the morning of the party, I'd received 2 more versions of the same message, from an aunt and from Vanessa's godmother, both referencing chipping in through Vanessa, both clearly under the impression that my sister was funding some meaningful portion of an event I had already paid for, in full, weeks earlier. I did the math sitting on the edge of my bed at 6 in the morning while David slept beside me, still tired from a red-eye flight home the night before, and the number I landed on, based on what I could piece together from 3 separate texts, was somewhere close to $900, solicited from family members, for a party that did not need a single additional cent. I told myself I would deal with it after. Not today. Today was breeze. The party itself started beautifully. It really did. Rosa's team had the tent glowing by 2 in the afternoon. The food was exactly what we'd planned, down to the lemon bars I'd insisted on making myself because they were Bree's favorite as a little girl. My daughter walked around in her white sundress, glowing in a way I will remember for the rest of my life, hugging aunts and cousins, showing off her acceptance letter like it was a gold medal, which, frankly, it was. And then, 40 minutes in, Vanessa gave her toast. I've already told you the line that opened this story. Someone had to make it happen, but it wasn't the toast itself that landed the real blow. It was 90 seconds later, when Bree, glowing, a little emotional, turned to the crowd and said, "Thank you, Mom, and thank you, Aunt Vanessa, for all of this," and reached out to hug us both. Vanessa laughed, not unkindly, exactly. That's what made it land the way it did. The same easy, warm laugh she uses for everything, which is what let her get away with what came next, in front of 40-some witnesses who all just laughed along with her. "Oh, sweetie, your mom just shows up and complains about the noise levels," she said, waving a hand at me, still smiling. "I'm the one who actually put this whole thing together." The table laughed. Not cruelly. That was the worst part. The same way it's always the worst part. They laughed the easy way. People laugh at something they've already decided, somewhere along the way, must be true. Because why would anyone say it about themselves if it weren't? My mother beamed at Vanessa like she'd just been crowned something. My daughter's smile faltered for exactly 1 second, a small flicker of confusion crossing her face before she recovered it. Because 18-year-olds have learned, same as the rest of us, to arrange their expressions around what a room has already decided is true. I set the tray of lemon bars down on the nearest table. I didn't say anything yet. I just set it down, squared it against the edge of the tablecloth, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very clear. Because I already knew, in that moment, that the mom who just shows up was about to find out exactly how much showing up she'd actually done, and I intended, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to let the truth arrive on its own timeline instead of smoothing it over one more time to keep the peace. I walked into the kitchen for a few minutes, ostensibly to check on the second tray of lemon bars warming in the oven, actually because I needed 4 walls and a closed door between myself and 40 people who had just laughed, warmly, easily, at the idea that I complain about noise levels at events I plan and fund from start to finish. I stood at the counter and made myself breathe the way I tell anxious kids to breathe, in my office at work. In for 4 counts, hold, out for 6, and I genuinely considered, standing there, just letting it go. It was one toast. Bree was happy. My mother was happy. Vanessa would forget she'd even said it by the time the cake came out, the way she forgets most things that don't serve the story she's currently telling about herself. I had spent 38 years choosing the version of events that kept the peace, and some tired, well-worn part of me reached for that choice automatically, the way your hand reaches for a light switch in a room you've lived in your whole life. David found me there, still holding an oven mitt I hadn't actually used for anything. He'd caught the tail end of the toast from across the yard and could tell, the way husbands of 20 years can tell, that something in my face had gone somewhere else. He didn't tell me what to do. He just asked if I was okay, and when I said I honestly didn't know, he said, "You don't have to decide anything right now, just get through the cake." It was, I think, the most useful thing anyone said to me that entire day. because it gave me permission to not resolve it in the next 5 minutes, and also, quietly, permission to not pretend it hadn't happened at all. I want to tell you what happened over the next hour, because it did not happen the way you might expect, and I think that matters. I did not confront Vanessa. I did not pull her aside for a hissed argument behind the garage, the way these things sometimes go in families like ours. What I did instead was quieter, and in hindsight, it was the only thing that actually worked. About 20 minutes after the toast, Rosa found me near the drink table to go over the final head count for the to-go containers, and, not knowing any better, not knowing she was about to become part of something much bigger than leftover potato salad, she said, loudly enough for the small cluster of relatives nearby to hear, "Naomi, I just wanted to say thank you again for being so on top of everything. The deposit, the final balance, all 9 days early. You made this the easiest booking I've had all year." I watched my mother's face change first, then my aunt's, then, a beat later, Vanessa's, standing 6 feet away with a mimosa in her hand, hearing in real time the exact math not adding up. My cousin Priya, God bless her, was the one who actually said it out loud. "Wait," she said, looking between Rosa and Vanessa, "so what did my $200 go toward then?" Nobody answered right away. My Aunt Connie, standing just behind Priya with a plate of Rosa's chicken in her hand, said, more to herself than anyone, "I sent 30 on top of that, I think. I just Venmo'd whatever the request said." Vanessa's godmother, a step further back, went very still in the particular way people go still when they're doing quiet math about their own bank account in public. I watched Vanessa's mouth open and then close, watched her reach for the easy laugh that had worked 40 minutes earlier, and find, this time, that it wouldn't quite come. And I want to be honest with you, I felt an old, familiar pull in that silence, the pull to rescue the moment, to make a joke, to say, "Oh, you know, Vanessa probably meant the photo booth, let's not make this a whole thing at Bree's party." I have spent my entire life performing that rescue. I did not perform it this time. My father, Ray, who had said almost nothing all afternoon, the way he says almost nothing at most family gatherings, reached into his shirt pocket and took out his phone. He'd been quiet for a reason, it turned out. 2 weeks earlier, my mother had forwarded him one of Vanessa's group texts asking family to pitch in for Bree's big day, a message that had struck him as odd enough, he said later, that he'd taken a screenshot, just in case, without fully knowing what he was saving it for. He held the phone out, not dramatically, not as an accusation, just a quiet, factual offering, the way he'd hand you a tool if you were struggling with something in the garage. "This the one you mean, Priya?" It was. In 41 years, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd watched my father volunteer himself into the middle of a conflict between his wife and his daughters. Ray's peacekeeping strategy, for as long as I'd been alive, was a kind of careful invisibility. Agree with whoever spoke last, keep the peace, let Sylvia run the emotional weather of the house. Watching him hold that phone out, calm and unhurried, in front of the exact person he'd spent 30 years learning not to contradict, told me more about how far this had gone than anything Priya or Rosa had said. I did not raise my voice through any of this. I want that to be clear, because I think the version of this story people expect involves shouting, and that is not what happened, and I don't believe it's what needed to happen. What happened instead was smaller and, I think, more final. Rosa, without any idea she was standing in the middle of a family reckoning, simply confirmed, one more time, gently, that the final balance had cleared from my account 9 days prior. I confirmed it too, out loud, calmly, to the 8 or 9 people now quietly gathered near the drink table. I paid Rosa in full in March, and again in June, I said. I never asked anyone for anything. I don't know what the Venmo requests were for. Vanessa tried, at that point, to recover the room the way she always has, with warmth, with a laugh, with a hand on my mother's arm, and a line about how money gets confusing with big events. Who even keeps track? When the warmth didn't work, Vanessa tried a second approach, the way people do when the first one visibly fails in front of an audience. I was actually going to put whatever was left toward a gift for their apartment next year, she said, to no one in particular, to everyone at once. I just hadn't figured out the details yet. It was, I noticed, the first version of an explanation that had come with a plan attached, which told me, more than anything else that afternoon, how much of the previous 90 seconds had been entirely improvised. Priya, to her enormous credit, only said, "Oh, okay, well, next time, maybe just ask," instead of, and let the sentence trail off into the kind of silence that says the rest of it clearly enough without anyone having to be unkind out loud. But something had already shifted, and no amount of warmth was going to shift it back, because the math was sitting right there in Rosa's easy compliment and my father's screenshot and Priya's very reasonable question, none of which I had orchestrated, none of which I needed to orchestrate, because the truth, once it's finally allowed into a room, tends to finish its own sentences. My mother, to her credit or not, tried to smooth it into nothing. "I'm sure Vanessa just used it for the little extras," she said, looking around for agreement. "The photo booth. The $200 from Priya alone doesn't cover a photo booth rental for 4 hours, Sylvia," my father said, quietly. Which, from Ray, who has spent 30 years staying out of exactly this kind of thing, landed harder in that yard than anything I could have said myself. I didn't ask Vanessa to pay anyone back in front of the whole party. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to, in the moment, wanted the full, satisfying, televised reckoning. But I looked over at my daughter, standing by the cake table in her white sundress, watching all of this unfold with an expression somewhere between confusion and dawning understanding, and I made a choice instead to protect the rest of her day. I told the small cluster around me, calmly, that we could sort out the details later, and that right now, there was a graduate who deserved everyone's attention back on her. And then I picked the tray of lemon bars back up, and I walked it over to the dessert table, and I let the party keep moving. It did not, of course, stay quiet after that. These things never do, and I no longer believe they're supposed to. Over the following week, 3 more relatives reached out to me directly, unprompted. Once word had made its way around the family, the way word always does. A total of just over $900 solicited, all told, of which Vanessa was able to account for roughly $150, spent on a photo booth rental she had, to be fair, actually provided. The rest, she told our mother in a conversation Sylvia later relayed to me, almost apologetically, had gone toward things that felt necessary at the time. A dress she'd bought for the party, a manicure, a contribution toward her own rent that month that she'd fully intended to pay back before anyone noticed. That same night, after the last guests had gone, and David had fallen asleep on the porch swing with his shoes still on, Bree came and sat next to me on the back step, still in her white sundress, a paper plate of cold lemon bars balanced on her knee. "Did Aunt Vanessa really not pay for any of this?" she asked. I told her the truth, as plainly and as gently as I could, not to make her a co-conspirator in some grudge against her aunt, but because I had decided, somewhere in that yard that afternoon, that I was done teaching my daughter that love means quietly absorbing whatever the loudest person in the room decides to take credit for. Bree was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small enough to still fit entirely under my arm, and said, "I knew you did all of it. I just didn't know why nobody else seemed to." "Would it have changed anything?" I asked her, "if I'd corrected Aunt Vanessa right there at the toast?" Bree thought about it with the same seriousness she brings to everything, a trait she did not get from my side of the family by accident. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think people believe whoever talks first and loudest, unless somebody makes them look at the actual math." She paused. "You basically just let the math talk instead of you." That was kind of smart, Mom. 18 years old, and she'd already named, more precisely than I had, exactly what I'd done. I did not call Vanessa to yell at her. I called her 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening while she was, she mentioned, trying to relax after an exhausting week, and told her, calmly, that she needed to repay every relative who had sent her money, individually, with an honest explanation, within 30 days, and that if she didn't, I would send the screenshots my father had saved to each of them myself, with no explanation needed, because the numbers would speak clearly enough on their own. I told her I loved her. I told her I had spent 38 years letting her be the version of herself that got the warmth and the benefit of the doubt, and that I was not interested anymore in also being the version of myself that quietly cleaned up whatever that cost other people. She cried. She said I was humiliating her over $900. I told her, gently, that I hadn't humiliated her at all. Rosa's kind comment, and Priya's honest question, and our father's saved screenshot had simply let the truth stand where it already was. I had just finally stopped standing in front of it. She repaid 4 of the 5 relatives within 3 weeks. The 5th, our Aunt Connie, told her not to worry about it, which I suspect bothered Vanessa more than if she'd demanded it back with interest. My mother called me 11 days after the party, and it was not the conversation I expected. I thought, if she called at all, it might be to say something small and conciliatory. Instead, Sylvia wanted to talk about how uncomfortable the whole thing had made everyone, how I could have handled it privately instead of letting it become a whole production in front of Connie and the Delgado woman, and whether I understood how humiliating it was for Vanessa to have that aired out in front of family. I let her finish. Then I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether she had been similarly concerned about how it felt for me to stand at my own daughter's party being told, in front of 40 people, that I just show up and complain. Sylvia was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing I think she'd actually called to say, underneath all the rest of it. You've always been so sensitive about this, Naomi. Vanessa doesn't mean anything by it. I told my mother, gently, but without softening it into nothing, the way I'd been doing for 4 decades, that whether Vanessa meant anything by it had stopped being the question the day 40 people laughed along with it. I told her I loved her, and that I wasn't angry, and that I also wasn't available anymore to have this specific conversation every few years with a new set of details attached to the same old shape. Then I asked about her garden, because I meant what I said about not being angry, and because some conversations are complete once you've said the true thing out loud, whether or not the other person receives it the way you'd hoped. I used to think that being the reliable one meant I wasn't allowed to also want to be seen. I know better now, and if you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. I spent most of my life believing that being the reliable one meant I forfeited the right to also want to be noticed, that you could have the credit, or you could have the quiet satisfaction of doing it right, but almost never both. I don't believe that anymore, and if this story reaches anyone tonight, the way I hope it does, I hope it's the person still standing at the edge of their own party. Your labor is not background noise for someone else's spotlight. Your love is not required to stay silent so someone else's story sounds better. And showing up, quietly, for years, without applause, was never the same thing as not mattering. It only ever looked that way to people who benefited from believing it. I didn't humiliate my sister. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only gift I have left to offer this story. I only stopped being the person who made it easy for everyone else to see her clearly, and me not at all. What people finally noticed after that, they noticed on their own. A caterer's honest thank you, a cousin's honest question, a father's quiet screenshot. I didn't orchestrate a single one of them. I just finally stopped standing in the way of the truth, doing what it was always going to do eventually. I still make those lemon bars every year for Bree's birthday, same recipe, same slightly too much lemon zest she's loved since she was small enough to stand on a kitchen chair and help me juice them. She leaves for university in 10 weeks. I intend to enjoy every one of the Saturdays between now and then, string lights or no string lights, toast or no toast, exactly as loudly as I want to. Comment below, has anyone ever taken credit for something you quietly built, in front of people who should have known better? I'd like to know how you handled it, and whether you'd handle it the same way again. Whatever this stirred up in you tonight, you're allowed to feel it. This is a work of fiction, written for reflection and entertainment, though I suspect a few of you recognized a face in it that wasn't Vanessa's at all. If there's one thing worth carrying out of it, let it be this. The people who quietly do the work are not invisible. They're just often the last ones in the room to finally believe it themselves.